Well, today my name is James Love. I'm with KEI. We're going to have a talk by Professor Bhaven Sampat from both Columbia University and now visiting at the Engelberg Center at New York University. Professor Sampat teaches the Yeoman School of Public Health at Columbia University. He's an economist and an expert on innovation and on patents. And he's going to talk to us today about his research on the role of governments in funding research and development. I'll allow him to introduce himself further. Before we start and I introduce the professor, I'd like to go around and have the participants introduce themselves. And I think we can start with the people that are well, I think we'll start with the people in the room first, and then we'll get to the people that are online. So, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'm Elizabeth. I work at KEI, and I help organize the event.
My name is Claire Cassidy. I also work for KEI.
Ann Bay?
Oh, my name is Ann Beatrix Keller. I'm a translator.
My name is Andy Goldman. I'm an attorney here at KEI.
And my name is Diane. I'm the scientific advisor at KEI.
I'm Zach. I'm with KEI, do communications.
Zach Struber.
Zach Struber, yes.
Jamie Love, KEI.
Manon West.
If we could go to the online people. Joel, you want to start?
Joel Lichten from York University in Canada.
Joel's also published a fair amount of research on drug pricing and R&D cost. Julia?
Excuse me.
Julia?
Hi, good morning. My name is Julia. I'm with MSF in the Access Campaign, working with Judith Roos and Lon.
Through?
Oh, you're
Can you unmute yourself?
Zero.
You're muted.
I can't.
There you go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Through with KEI. Can you hear me? No.
And through our Geneva office, and then
Who's that? Andrea?
Andre.
Hello, hope you can hear me. My name is Andreas Panagopoulos. I'm a managerial economist from the University of Crete, so I'm from far, far away.
Wow. Great.
Great to have you.
And Elizabeth's on. And then Professor Sampat, you want to introduce yourself, and then you can go ahead and proceed with the talk, and I think Lizzie will help you with the slides.
Great. So I'm Bhaven Sampat. I'm an economist by training, and at the Bhaven School of Public Health at Columbia in the Department of Health Policy and Management. Though, as Jamie indicated, this year I'm visiting at NYU Law and the Wagner School of Public Policy. What else is there to say? I typically work on issues at the intersection of health policy and innovation policy. I've done work on the political economy of the NIH, on the Bayh-Dole Act, on pharmaceutical patent policy, and kind of everything in the U.S. and abroad. And also did some work some time ago, which is the paper I'll start by talking about today, and hoping to go back to it, on the division of labor between the public and private sectors in pharmaceutical innovation and policy implications thereof. So that's the general introduction. That's the introduction of me. Should I just jump into the substance or proceed otherwise?
Oh, jumping in. That's good.
Okay, I'm jumping. So, so first, thank you all for inviting me to do this, and to Jamie, Elizabeth, Claire, and everyone else for putting it together. The paper that was circulated is, in fact, as I indicated, an old paper, about 5 years old, written with Frank Lichtenberg, who's an economist at Columbia Business School. And I was actually initially, as Jamie will attest to, reluctant to present such an old paper, but Jamie assured me we could use this as a launching pad so I could get your ideas and we could have a discussion about useful things to measure going forward, and different better ways to measure things. And having long appreciated the work that KEI has done on these issues, and I see a number of people as part of this hangout have done work on this these set of issues too. I very much want to get through the kind of formal presentation and do the hangout portion, so I'll try to do that. That said, Elizabeth, could you put up slide number 1?
Yes. There.
Okay. Unfortunately, I can't actually see the slides at any good resolution on my screen, but is that just a slide that says why does it matter?
Why does knowing the public and private sector matter?
Perfect. So I'll try to remember what was on that slide. So the issue of the relative contribution of the public and private sectors, in fact, goes back a long way, not only in medicine, but also kind of in science policy in general. So the NSF and the Department of Defense have had these kind of debates, for lack of a better word, going back to the 60s and 70s, and there's famous reports like Traces and Project Hindsight and all that kind of stuff, trying to look at kind of the extent to which applications arising from publicly funded research arise from basic research or from applied research, what was the role of industry and all that. So it's really, oh, that's much better. It's really a long debate in general. In the medical arena, the question has come up recurrently in at least 3 policy debates. The first is evaluating the returns to NIH investment, the general question of are we getting our money's worth for the $30 billion a year we spend now on the NIH. A second area that it's come up is in the context of debates about high drug costs and drug prices, and also debates about patents and patent exclusivity. There has been some suggestion that the reason we need these high drug prices is, in fact, private sector R&D is extremely costly. The reason we need long patents is that private sector R&D is extremely costly. If it turns out that the public sector does a lot of the work, that argument has less traction, or at least it needs to be more nuanced. And then the third way in which it's come up is various proposals to harness the public sector role in the pharmaceutical innovation process to try to control prices, promote access, and recoup profits. And that involves proposals like margin, like recoupment, even kind of the UAIM equitable access license, proposals of that flavor to try to use the upstream, generally an upstream patent position of the public sector to try to do something about the things we care about downstream that the system is currently configured is not doing very well. So that's a general background. The conceptual point in the paper that was circulated, to the extent that there's a conceptual point, is just that there's different types of public sector roles, and they matter differently for the different policy debates that were just laid out. So you can imagine a direct public sector role, where the Public Sector Research Institute, either the NIH itself, intramurally, or extramural NIH grantees, kind of are involved in actually discovering the compound, or synthesizing it, or formulating it, or whatever. And since approximately since the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, typically in that situation, the public sector is going to hold the upstream patent. That's the sort of direct role. The indirect role, and as I read the paper, with 5 years of distance from writing it, I realized indirect is perhaps not the right term, maybe enabling or something else. We can talk about that. But there's a kind of broader role where the public sector is not really involved in discovering the compound per se, but the key insight kind of comes from the public sector. So interfering with angiogenesis kills tumors, or the public sector develops research tools or instruments that are key to downstream R&D. So I've listed some examples there. So those are 2 different roles the public sector may have. Another thing that kind of struck me in rereading the paper is that there's other roles as well that weren't discussed in the paper at all, and we can come back to that later on. The key point is that these different roles have different implications for the different policy debates that we started out with. In particular, for the first policy debate, are we getting our money's worth from NIH investment, like you'd care both about the direct and indirect rules of public sector R&D. The same is true for the second policy debate about, how much does the private sector actually spend on R&D. If it turns out that the public sector is actually doing a very large chunk of the R&D that leads to successful drugs, some of those arguments about high prices and long exclusivity may ring hollow. But here again, I don't think that debate needs to distinguish necessarily between the direct and indirect roles. However, the third debate, the third set of debates, I should say, those that try to harness the public sector role to do something about prices and access, for those, margin, recoupment, things like that, it's the direct effect that's relevant. Typically, you need an upstream patent in order to be able to operationalize those policies, or at least that's what I think. I'm open to other people's thoughts on that as well. So what we try to do in the paper is to try to measure bibliometrically both the direct and indirect effects. The direct effect is conceptually, at least, quite easy. In practice, it runs into some difficulties. So again, the direct effect is where the government researcher actually helps develop the actual compound, typically takes out the university, or for intramural researchers, the NIH typically take out a patent on that compound. And all one needs to do there is to look at, if we start from the bottom of this chart and kind of work our way up, you can look at all the patents on the FDA's Orange Book. You can look at assignee information on those patents, so was it owned by the Department of Health and Human Services. You can look at government interest statements in those patents, which in theory, all patents emanating from publicly funded research are supposed to have, and kind of get a sense of the number and the share of drugs where you see a trace of the direct public sector role. So in principle, in this case, I think this is the drug Xalatan. You can, through this simple technique, essentially trace it back to an NIH grant, a National Eye Institute grant to Columbia University. Actually, the grant stream started several decades before the drug was actually commercialized. So that's the direct effect. So in theory, it's pretty easy to do. There's some gaps between theory and practice, which we can talk about going forward. The indirect effect is harder because, just thinking back to some of the examples that I started out with, how do you trace the effect of these kind of disembodied knowledge, that's sort of in the air? So think of, Watson and Crick discovering the double helical structure of DNA. Like, how do you trace the actual effect of that on downstream drug development? It's really, really hard to do. I mean, on one hand, it obviously seems to matter a lot, but on the other hand, there's not kind of neat paper trails. One way in which economists have tried to trace intellectual influence of this sort is to use patent citation data to look at the prior art that's cited in patents, which can include both previous patents but also publications. And the way to do that is essentially, again, if we work from the bottom up, you can start with an FDA-approved drug. You can find it in the Orange Book, and we could talk more about what the Orange Book is for those of you who may not know. But essentially, it's a list. It's an FDA-curated list of drugs associated with, patents associated with marketed drugs. We can then go to the patent office and look at all the citations to previous patents, but also to previous publications in the patents associated with those drugs, and then, this is kind of the hard part. We need to figure out the extent to which those publications were from the public sector. It turns out we can link back through PubMed and other sources to find the actual funding sources of those publications. So that's the way in which we can trace from a NIH grant down to a drug that's linked to it indirectly, we say, through these sort of citation links. So those are two cases. The only hard part of this paper was just to kind of aggregate that up to the universe, or at least a universe. And we tried to do this for all new molecular entities approved between 1988 and 2005, about 478 drugs. We collected the drug patent information. One issue there is that the current Orange Book, the one that you find online, is typically a point-in-time snapshot, so we had to pull together the kind of history of all Orange Books, the mother of all Orange Books, and concatenate them, so we did that. And then we looked for all the patents on the Orange Book. To trace the direct effect, we looked both at the assignee information on those patents to see if it was assigned to the Department of Health and Human Services, and also government interest statements to see if those patents had government interest statements indicating government support. To look at the indirect effect, we looked at, again, all the patents in the Orange Book, but we looked back at all the citations in those patents, both to previous patents and to previous publications, and again, tried to figure out the funding sources of those previous patents and publications. And that's basically how we measure the indirect effect. That involved some kind of fancy computer programming that I actually didn't do myself. We got a bioinformatics person to do. It's quite tricky to match the unstructured references in patents to publications to actually the structured references in PubMed, and that involved some computational techniques that were beyond my ability. So we worked with some computer programmers to do that, and we validated it in various ways, and it looks pretty good. So that's the basic data collection effort. We also kind of linked it to sales, just to, at the end of the day, say something about the share of sales that we could attribute to the public sector in these different ways, but won't talk about that all that much. So next I wanted to show the results, but should I just pause here for a second and see if there's any questions before I just show the results, or should I just charge ahead?
Well, let's pause for a second. Does anyone have any questions before we proceed in this presentation?
Either unmute or indicate on the group chat.
Yeah.
There'll be plenty of times for questions later.
All right, let's keep going. I think.
All right, very efficient. So this is the kind of the main chart in the paper. I think it's called Exhibit 1. That kind of lays out the share of the drugs that that either have this direct link that have a public sector patent, or this indirect link that they have patents that cite back to public sector patents or publications. And the key is, if we focus on the rightmost column, so all drugs, about 9% of all drugs have a public sector patent. So we see this direct link between public sector research and drug development for about 9% of the drugs. About half of the drugs have these indirect links, which is that they cite back to public sector patents or publications. So pretty sharp differences there. We also see differences across standard and priority review drugs. You can imperfectly think of priority review drugs as being kind of more important drugs. A lot of people do that. And you'll see that for both channels, both the direct and the indirect, they're much greater for priority review drugs, the more important drugs, than they are for standard review drugs. If we focus on the 155 priority review drugs, about 1 in 5 have this sort of direct link, and about 65%, or about 2/3, have these indirect links. And it's just worth noting that this 1 in 5 number is quite similar to to the results that other researchers who were doing stuff around the same time as us, maybe a bit later than us, find using slightly different approaches. So some of the work by Ashley Stevens, Neller, and others, they basically, you end up with 20 to 30% of priority review drugs have this kind of direct link. and though I don't think other people have looked at the indirect links, the qualitative accounts of the sort of direct and indirect role, including some of the work that Kesselheim and Avorn have done, suggests that these indirect links are actually quite common and more common than the direct links. So other research is quite consistent with this. So the next slide, actually, if you could just go up one again, just to think through like what are the implications of this. I think it really depends on your prior. So if you know, based on these results, it seems like something like recoupment or margin or those kinds of policies under current patent laws and procedures would seem possible for about 1 in 5 important drugs. Whether that's big or small, I don't know, but it reinforces the idea that if we want to think about both the feasibility and the desirability of policies like this, we need to think carefully about the direct role versus the indirect role, and hopefully we can talk more about that when I'm finished with these slides. So let me just lay out 2 limitations of this kind of approach, and then talk a little bit about what sorts of things I think it would be interesting to do next, and to invite your thoughts on that. So the first limitation relates to this measure of the indirect effect. So I used the citations in this paper as a measure of intellectual influence. One thing I didn't mention in the introduction is that a lot of my research kind of at least raises questions about the extent to which citation-based indicators are reasonable indicators of knowledge flows or intellectual influence. There's reasons to believe that a lot of citations are just kind of noise and might just be in there for strategic and legal reasons and may not, in fact, represent any real link, in which case we would see an overstatement of the public sector role. And probably it's also the case that some important public sector roles, including training and things like that, might not be picked up through citations, which would lead to an understatement. So I think, you know, one of the things, we use citations in this paper, and other people do too, because it's really the best that anybody can do in large samples, but I think there are real questions that ought to be tackled going forward about what these citations actually represent. And it's sort of useful to think about the counterfactual. If we see if we see a drug patent that's citing back to, say, an NYU publication, is the counterfactual that that private sector drug patent wouldn't exist at all without every single article, without that article and every single article that was cited, that it would have occurred anyhow, but with some delay or higher cost? I'm not sure, but I think those are all reasonable questions. So one of the things I'm hoping to do going forward, and I've started to do now, is to kind of get a better sense of the meaning of these patent citations that we use to nail down the indirect approach. My sort of qualitative review so far suggests that there's 4 types of citations. One is where you cite an article which provides some general background on the disease. A second, where you provide general background, where the article provides general background on a class of compounds. A third, sort of research tools and processes, and a fourth, more directly related to the therapy or its evaluation. If that bears out in kind of further work in a larger sample study, it's obvious that you'd want to unpackage those in thinking about the different contributions of the public sector. So that's one sort of thing to work on the indirect side. Let me next turn to the limitations on the measuring the direct effect. Remember, we are measuring the direct effect here in 2 ways. We are looking at the extent to which patents on the Orange Book have assignees that are public sector assignees, most prominently the Department of Health and Human Services, but also we're relying on government interest statements in those patents. But it is known that there is underreporting of government interest statements, or historically there has been underreporting of actual government funding on the front page of patents. Some work that I cite here that I did with R.T. Rai, who's at Duke, suggests that well, even a lot of the things that end up being reported to NIH Edison, which is, to the Edison database, which is the federal government's database of where universities report back to the government on patents resulting from federally funded research. 30% of the things that are reported to the NIH via Edison don't include government interest statements, and I think by definition all of them should. So there is substantial underreporting. We also did some sort of in the paper with Artie some qualitative work looking at specific drugs, and we in fact found a number of drugs that probably we should have seen direct links if things were reported properly, but we didn't. So the lack of reporting may be one reason for the low direct effect. Now, frankly, in the paper with Lichtenberg, we do various things to show that that the kind of order of magnitude of the result is probably not going to be all that different if you just get better reporting, but I'd like to push on that front a little bit going forward as well, just to kind of get that right. So I think I have one more slide, maybe two. So ongoing work, I just kind of said this, it involves filling in the gaps to try to nail down, in particular, the direct effect to make it more robust to potential underreporting. I've also been playing around with some machine classification techniques that try to use information on publications resulting from NIH grants to figure out if there's patents out there that in fact should have been reported that were not, and maybe sometime down the road, though certainly not today, I'll be able to report back on that. So that's just the kind of ongoing how one would do this a little bit better. There's also a question of extending the scope of this analysis, and this is very much the type of thing that I'm thinking about doing now and like to invite your thoughts on. First, we're looking at NDAs. Doing so may miss a lot of biological approvals, and obviously biotech is an area where the public sector role is at least thought to be more pronounced, so it would be useful to sort of do that. The issue there is that once you move beyond NDAs, it's hard to get lists of patents, though if people know how, I would be very interested. Second, I know this is something that people at KEI have worked on. I would be interested in thinking about how to measure, either in individual cases or in a large sample, other types of government roles, including clinical trial funding, trading, and orphan credits. Shifting dimensions a little bit, I'm also interested in kind of looking at the growing role of the government as a buyer of drugs and the sort of procurement role that the government has in incentivizing and providing a market for private sector R&D. And more generally, just looking at changes over time to paint a sort of comprehensive historical account of the evolving division of labor between the public and private sector, so that we can start asking the question, how did the system get this way, and if we designed it again from scratch, would we do it the same way or perhaps do something different? So that's, I think, all I have to present. Thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I think that was that's a great introduction to the paper, and also to your looking forward in terms of future work. I'd like to start with the people that are online. I know we've Rashma, you joined us too, right? You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Reshma Ramachandran. Just recently transitioned to Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we brought over the Anthony So's program from Duke Global Health and Technology Access to the School of Public Health. Work on pharmaceutical policy, primarily on antibiotics, but also on drug pricing and looking at actually public-private partnerships and their role in innovation.
Great. Is there anyone that's online that would like to ask any questions or make any comments about the paper that in the presentation?
And while we're talking, if you also have a question, indicate in the group chat on the side, and I will make sure that we get to you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I mean, as far as I can see, about 20% of all priority drugs, 1 out of 5, have one way or another come from NHS funding. Okay? Why would it be so hard when you get that type of funding to install a clause that says do not patent exclusively, do not license exclusively the patent? If you don't license the patent exclusively, then we go back to slide number 1 when our presenter asked what about all this money that you spent. By non-exclusive licensing, immediately you introduce some form of competition. That would really solve a lot of problems, at least from an economist perspective, wouldn't it?
Professor, do you want to give a comment?
Let me give you. So actually, Jamie, I think you're better positioned to answer the kind of question about why would it be so hard to include the kind of the politics side of that question and the law. I will say, and I'm not endorsing this. I just want to. The response back would be that absent the prospect of an exclusive license, no firm would invest in the downstream development, including clinical trials, to carry forward drugs like xalotane. That would be the response back. And we could talk about whether that's reasonable or not.
Okay, if I could, well, first of all, I think you should start with the fact that drugs are protected by more than patent rights in the United States and Europe and all the TPP countries now, as well as other high-income countries. They start out with the fact that the NDAs have 5 years of exclusive rights on test data, and they have closer to 11 years in Europe, and they have 7 years now, I think, in Canada. They have different terms in different countries, and a minimum of 5 years in all the TPP countries. And so even if they had no patents, if you were to register a product and invest in the clinical trials, you'd have that protection, which for some products, as we saw with Taxol, for example, that had no patents on it, was a pretty significant barrier to entry. You also have access to the orphan drug exclusivity, which is between 10 and the country between 7 and 10 years, which is even broader than a patent in some countries. So one thing that you do have, you have these sui generis IPR things, which are independent of patents. So even if you had non-exclusive licensing, you would still benefit from those things.
It's a good point.
The next thing I would say is that in a proposal that Senator Sanders made when he was a member of the House of Representatives, he said that he proposed that when you had a government-funded product, that you'd have a sort of an assumption of non-exclusive licensing, but the government could waive that and then could have a determination that there had to be some period of monopoly that was associated with the product. But then there was a recommendation to how you'd resolve what the benefit would be. So one proposal he had on exclusive licensing was that you give the exclusive company to the company that agreed to a development investment regime, but would sell the drug at the lowest price. Another option was a company that would agree to the shortest term of exclusivity on the patent. Another possibility was you'd auction it out in such a way that you'd agree to give it to the company that would agree to the a trigger of when the revenue reached a certain amount of money, they would give up the monopoly. And so what this was an attempt to do was to create a competitive system to figure out how much of a monopoly or how much of a premium over the generic price was necessary to induce people to fund the clinical trials. Now, what you have instead is everybody gets life of patent, no strings attached for all these products, and so there's no effort whatsoever to limit the profits in any way different than any product that receives no subsidies from the government right now.
I think that's very useful. One thing, I will say that, I wrote a book on Bayh-Dole, and in fact, one of the proposals we had there was a presumption of non-exclusive license, a rebuttable presumption of non-exclusive licensing. So I think that's, a reasonable thing. One thing you run into in these debates, though, is that the number of suitors for these technologies is often just one, right? So if you believe Marie Thursby's work, it's not like people are knocking down the doors to license these technologies. So oftentimes, you don't have actually the prospect of any real competitive bidding.
Well, I would say that in some of the cases we've looked at in the cancer area, the opposite has been true. In the case of cisplatin, when the initial 5-year of exclusivity rolled, there was like about a half a dozen companies that petitioned the NIH to sell the product for the remaining term. And at that point, the NIH was forced to make the originator lower the price by 30% and fund $40 million in independent research, which back in the early 80s was a lot of money. And then in the case of Taxol, there was quite a few companies that wanted the Taxol franchise what the government licensed with Taxol was not the patents, was the data.
Mm-hmm.
And the rights of exclusive data, but there was quite a few suitors for that one. So I agree that there are cases when it's hard to get even one suitor, but I think it depends a little bit about what the evidence is that the invention is really valuable. So I think it really varies.
So that would be an interesting thing to try to figure out in a large sample, right? And maybe we'll talk a little bit about transparency, Edison, and all that kind of stuff. But that would be the kind of thing that it would be useful to try to get some large sample data on to kind of make this decision right.
Yeah, I think that if you start with the assumption that you want one-size-fits-all policy, what you're gonna find is a whole set of cases where the drug will only be invested in is if you give up everything. So in a one-size-fits-all policy, you can always tell a story that nobody's going to invest in an invention unless you give them 20 years of exclusive rights and other kinds of subsidies and stuff. And if that becomes the lowest common denominator, you just are always just giving up everything. But if it was your IP, if you were paying for it on the other end, if you took it seriously, you'd have a much more nuanced approach, and you would basically treat the different drugs differently depending on how much leverage you thought in each case. But the people managing the government's assets are just acting like it's just an opportunity for them to make friends in the biotech sector. To give out, make everybody happy, and they don't really sort of explore in any way whatsoever the idea that they might have leverage in these areas.
That's reasonable.
There was a recent case involving hepatitis C. Now, as we all know, hepatitis C is a big budget buster right now for the U.S. It's driving a lot of the debate on drug prices. And so the NIH has patents on a whole class of field of use for new compounds and old compounds for treating hepatitis, which they put out a Federal Register notice this year to license on an exclusive basis. And they licensed it to a firm that we've never heard of before. And they don't have a web page, they don't have any SEC filings, they don't have any annual reports or anything. And so we asked the U.S. government if they could give us the names of the principals in the organization, and they said only if we signed a non-disclosure agreement, which we refused to do because we wanted to talk about it. So it was actually secret who the principals were in a company that was getting an exclusive right to a whole new class of compounds for hepatitis C, and that was just done this year. And also done very recently is a new molecular antibody, how do I say that?
Monoclonal antibody?
Yes, monoclonal antibody that's supposed to be for people that develop resistance to Herceptin. And it was licensed on an exclusive basis to a company in China with no reasonable pricing clause or anything else. So we took a monopoly. The drug that people take now, if they develop resistance to Herceptin, costs around $150,000 a year. So this was an NIH patent on another compound to do the same thing, and we gave a monopoly on this to some company in China. It was sort of a weird thing. So I think the NIH approach right now is not too focused on access, pricing, or taxpayer interest on these things.
We also have a question from Reshma. If you'd like to go ahead, Reshma.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I had a clarifying question and then another general question. So one, I was wondering in the slide when you talked about limitations in terms of the citations, you said that the reason why citations were included was for legal and strategic reasons. I was wondering if you can go into more detail regarding that. Yeah, like start off with that.
Yeah, sure. It's a very good question. So basically, if we focus on citations to the non-patent literature, because that's most of where we're going to be capturing the public sector role. So that's the most relevant one for the policy debate we're talking about today. Most of those things come from applicants, not examiners in the United States. So the way it works in the U.S. is you have a duty of candor to kind of report anything that's kind of relevant to the invention, and then the examiner does his or her own search and takes all that prior art and decides whether the claims in the patent are novel and non-obvious with respect to that prior art. It turns out that in the U.S. at least, I'm told the EPO is different, but in the U.S. at least, examiners don't do much in terms of searching or citing of non-patent prior art. It's mostly coming from applicants. So now applicants have choices about what to cite and what not to cite. There are some not so nefarious things that go on that would compromise the utility of citations as indicators of knowledge flows. Those include sometimes you just cite things as background. So this article said that cancer is bad, that don't actually really relate in a kind of critical way to the invention. And moreover, you could have cited something else, so the specific citation itself doesn't matter. That's neither strategic nor legal. That's just kind of a patent practice thing. Strategic or legal is people often talk about. So I'll start with the strategic, flooding the patent office. So if you have like a killer piece of prior art that like really, really, really matters, you might cite a whole bunch of other stuff too, just to kind of bury the really important prior art in the weeds in a context where patent examiners at the USPTO may not have the time, inclination, or resources to actually go through each citation in detail. So that's the strategic. You could also decide that, hey, I know somebody did something like this, but I don't know what the exact publication is, and I'm not going to bother to search for it. So that's a strategic choice that applicants make not to actually search for something. And under the duty of candor, you don't have to search. You just have to disclose what you know about. So that's another strategic point. And then the legal point is just that, you have to cite stuff that a reasonable examiner would consider material to patentability. I'm not sure that maps necessarily onto conceptual ideas of intellectual influence. So something might be related to what I did, even if it had no intellectual influence. So that's neither strategic nor legal, but that could still create some noise in the process of citation creation in a way that citations may not be good indicators of knowledge flows or intellectual influence.
Then my second question was in regards to the sales data and picking 2006. Because you were looking at NMEs that were approved between such a large period, I was wondering if there was kind of further analysis looking at, since the sales data for a drug that's just approved over time will probably change, and maybe after 3 or 4 years, when we've looked at models, that's when drugs might reach their peak sales. Would that be be something to look at, or indicate a difference between maybe public sector?
That's interesting. Yeah. So your point. So we have not done that. I mean, right. One could do that, and I think it's a very reasonable thing to do. I'll leave it at that. I could report back on that if you'd like, but haven't done that yet, I don't think.
All right, we also have a question from Joel. Joel, if you'd like to unmute and go ahead.
Sure. So you looked at, you drew a distinction between standard and priority review drugs. But I think that your assumption that priority review drugs are important new drugs is not nuanced enough. So first of all, I mean, compared to other countries, the U.S. gives priority reviews to a much larger percentage of products. So I've compared U.S. to Canada, for instance, and whereas the U.S. gives about 45%, Canada is down around 26 or 27%. But even beyond that, a priority review drug does not necessarily predict how therapeutically important that product's going to be. And there are databases that you can use to get a more nuanced idea of how important a new drug is in terms of additional therapeutic value. So I wondered if you could take your analysis further and look at drugs that are considered to be therapeutic, and whether or not for those the public sector involvement is larger or smaller.
So Joel, I don't know if it's just on my end, but the kind of key thing you said in the middle, drugs that are considered blank, I didn't actually hear you. You say that again?
Drugs that are considered therapeutically important additions.
Got it.
In other
what
words,
database is what I use for that?
well, there are a couple of things that I use. So one is the reviews of drugs that are published in a French drug bulletin called Prescrire International. And the second is, I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Canada, in order to set a price for new patented drugs, they're first reviewed by an independent organization within the Patent and Medicine Prices Review Board, a human drug advisory panel, and they rank drugs as breakthroughs, major therapeutic advances, and then they go moderate therapeutic advances, and little or no therapeutic advance. So I use a combination of the two of these databases, and you can sometimes drugs are evaluated by both organizations, sometimes just by one, but you can get an idea of the therapeutic, at least what these two groups think is the therapeutic value of a new product.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I'll probably follow up with you on that. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I have a couple quick questions. As I understand it, you're measuring the impact of USAA public sector funding, but not including any other public sector funding outside the United States of America. Is that correct?
Let me just think. It's been a while. So let's say probably yes, but it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. So one could, without too much work, because both the direct side, you can certainly look at the assignees that are, yeah. So you could, through assignees, you could look at non-U.S. entities, but there would be no government interest statement, so you would miss that, I guess.
Right. I'm just talking about what you did as opposed to what you could do right now.
Yeah. So I'm just right.
Yeah.
I'm kind of assuming I did everything that I could do, but that might not be a good assumption. Yeah, I think it was U.S. side. I think that's right. Yeah.
And it looks like, as others have mentioned, it looks like the role of the government in funding products was much more robust and significant for the more important drugs than for the least important drugs, which would be consistent with one's intuition on what the NIH should do.
Sure.
And then you said that you looked at the assignment of patents as well as a declaration on the patent legend as to whether or not there's a government interest in the patent. How common is it for you to find a patent where there's an assignment to a government entity, a public entity, but there's no declaration in the patent that the patent had government rights in it?
By government entity here, do you mean like the NIH, or do you mean like Harvard University?
Well, you said you look at the assignment of the patents.
Yeah.
declared the patents. I mean, as opposed to just looking at the patent declaration of government rights.
Yeah. So I have not looked at the extent of patents held by the Department of Health and Human Services that have government interest statements. I haven't looked at that. One could. Is that the question?
Well, I mean, is the reason that you looked at both is because the government doesn't declare a government interest if they are the signee? Is that why you did that, or was there?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. But it was much more pragmatic. It was, I don't need a government interest statement to tell me it's a government patent if it's actually owned by a government entity. I can just assume that it's a government patent.
I'm just wondering if there's cases where a private sector didn't declare a government interest in the patent, but then ended up assigning it to the Department of Energy or the NIH or some other CDC or something like that. Anyway,
this would be a reassignment. I'm not sure I'm following exactly mechanically what you mean here.
Well, there's an assignee for the patent.
Yes.
And then there's also a declaration of the patent whether there's a federal funds using the invention. Those are two separate things, right?
Right.
I'm just wondering if, in some cases, if the patent isn't assigned to a government agency, the invention is made by a non-government person, but there's no declaration that the government funds were used in the invention.
I see what you're saying. So this would be a transfer. This would be an actual transfer of ownership from a private entity to a public entity. I haven't looked at that now, but I suspect it's quite rare. That's
okay.
my.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that just means this. Yeah, because I mean, that's fine. So I wanted to call your attention to something in the U.S. law on energy patents, and in 42 U.S.C. 2187. I'll just repeat that one more time. 42 is the chapter in the United States Code, and then 2187 is the subsection on that. It's on compensation if there's a compulsory license, a patent involving nuclear energy, and they try and figure out how much money to give as compensation. They look at whether such patent was developed through federally funded research, but they don't really limit it to cases where there's a declaration on the patent. So that could be more consistent with the type of secondary things that you've identified in your study. I thought you might find that interesting because it's a little different than the margin provisions.
Yeah, that's right. So I wrote it down, and I'll take a look. That's super interesting, and I didn't know about it.
I'll let somebody else ask a question right now.
Reshma has one more.
Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, Reshma has one more question. Go ahead.
Yeah, that actually ties in pretty nicely with the question I had, was whether or not if you'd looked at in other sectors where government has partnered up with the public sector, or government's partnered up with the public sector, but also private industry to incentivize new technologies, like fracking, for instance. When in the 80s and 90s there was a government partnership with universities and offering tax incentives and regulatory relief, but with stipulations of compulsory licensing, but also making the upstream patents kind of like open source, so that other folks can use it and build upon it for further innovation. Is there any kind of examples of that in the pharmaceutical sector? I know there's like some talk about like compensatory liability regimes from Jerry Reichman and also from Marty Rye, and whether or not that could be something to look at, and what the pros and cons for like a tax incentives versus regulatory relief, like what's been proposed right now in 21st Century Cures, if that's a good or bad way to go.
So a lot of questions there, all very good ones. So I will say I haven't looked at the experiences of other sectors, and frankly, I don't intend to, but I think somebody should, and I'm very happy to read that. And in general, I think the kind of broader questions you ask about different policy approaches to try to achieve some of the goals we have, kind of beyond patents and exclusive licenses, that I've thought about a little bit in the context of drugs, but I think in general it's a very useful thing to to think about. But I haven't looked empirically at any of those issues yet.
Okay. I have a question. For the orphan drug tax credit, where you have aggregate data on the amount of on an annual basis, with a couple of years delay that the IRS publishes, and you have information about the designations and approvals for orphan designations. In a paper that that Lizzie is working on with some other people in the office, she's looked at cancer drugs, for example, and cancer drugs in 2014, 9 of 10 cancer drugs which were approved for marketing that were new molecular entities or new biologics were qualified for the orphan drug tax credit which is, as you know, it's a 50% credit toward the cost of the qualifying trials on the drugs. That's actually a very large number. It's 9 out of 10 new cancer drugs last year, very recent data. And I think over a longer period, it was something like 65%. So it's a significant number. So I was wondering if it would make sense not only to have more transparency of all these things, but to have the same kind of vital margin rights for a clinical trial that is financed with the subsidies available for the orphan drug tax credit. If they take the tax credit that you have in a patent, in the sense that you'd have a margin on the test data exclusivity associated with those trials.
Yeah, I mean, to me, in general, I'm quite. I think it makes sense to use, this 1 in 5 or whatever the number ends up being. For those drugs, I think it makes sense to use the rights that that the government has.
They have no tax credits are not associated with any public sector rights now.
I see. So you're talking about broader than that set.
Well, I'm asking if you should change. If you think it would be as an expert, as a consultant to the NIH, as a worldwide expert on the Bayh-Dole Act, who's published books with Dick Nelson and everything on this issue. In your opinion, expert opinion, should the Congress and the President and people running the government, should they consider attaching any public any obligations to the benefit of taking a tax credit to subsidize 50% of the cost of clinical trials for orphan drugs?
When you put it that way, my instinct is yes.
Well, I mean, you can rephrase.
No, listen. I mean, I tend not to offer policy prescriptions. I try to measure things, but it seems very sensible. So I wouldn't. I'd want to think about it a little bit more, but it seems very sensible.
Well, just follow up. Do you think there's a difference between a tax credit and a grant in terms of how things should be perceived as far as what the public sector benefits are of participating in the cost of the research?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
How would you contrast grants versus tax credits in terms of, from a public policy point of view? Do you see any difference at all between giving a tax credit and a grant, and then having a public stake in the or some legal benefit in the resulting research? For a grant, there's the Bayh-Dole Act, which sets out specifically what the government gets if they provide the grant. Tax credits are done differently. I just wondered if you, as an economist,
conceptually, no, I don't think conceptually there is a difference. But honestly, I haven't thought about the tax credit side of things more, so I'd want to think about it more before going on record. But yeah, conceptually, no.
And you think there's a significant underreporting of the disclosures on the patents? That's correct.
There was significant underreporting of the disclosures on the patents. I think that things are getting better over time. So especially over the 80s and 90s, there was significant undercompliance by universities in terms of what they were reporting to either the patent office or the NIH. I think it's getting better over time.
Is that because that was the period when the reasonable pricing clause was being exercised?
I don't think so. I just think that there was just learning curves by technology transfer offices, and they didn't really. Yeah, I think I don't think it was that strategic. I don't think it was that strategic. But I have no way of knowing.
Are you aware of the fact that in the TPP agreement there's a provision that restricts the amount of economic data or financial data on pricing, revenues, and other related data, which I think could be interpreted to extend to R&D cost or something like that, associated with the registration of a drug by the FDA. Had you ever been consulted on anything like this by the United States Trade Representative, or these issues about whether it would be a good idea to have less information from drug companies about financial issues, or do you have an opinion on it?
I was surprised. So I read about it on your blog, on KEI's blog, not that long ago, and I was very surprised to see that. Not just surprised as like, oh my God, this is silly kind of reaction, but like I was just surprised that rose to the attention of the TPP folks. Listen, I think it's a bad idea. I think it's I think as much like the thing we need more here, not just for research purposes, but also for policy purposes, is more transparency on who's doing what and how much things cost. I think that's an important input into policy, and getting that kind of data would make some of the indirect kind of measures that we try to come up with as economists unnecessary. It would just be really quite useful to get that, and I don't really see a reason. I don't see any reasonable justification for not promoting more transparency on those sorts of data. So I was quite surprised.
I'd like to ask a question to everybody on this call, and that was, would people here be interested in collaborating on a researcher's joint statement about what would be useful to have in terms of greater transparency that relate to the financial and economic issues of drugs? You know, just you've got this discussion of what on government funding of patents, but there's things on pricing, revenue, all sorts of other issues. Do you think it would be useful to have a group of research, not just one or two, but like, you know, like a large number of researchers that do work on these things, to sort of set out a transparency agenda that they'd like governments to approach? Maybe you could start with maybe Joel from Canada to sort of respond to this, and then maybe Rashma could also maybe chip in on this and some others.
So, Jamie, I'm not really sure at what level you would see this data. I mean, the data itself would be useful, but at what level would you see the data being used? So, would you see it being used in the in marketing approval, in setting prices? Where exactly?
Well, I think it is. When I looked at the TPP provisions, I understand why people, they may have opinions about whether you should link it to drug registration, because they may think that the drug registration should be as pure as possible, purely on medical outcome issues. I think that as a practical matter, people may feel that it gives them more leverage in terms of requiring the disclosure of the data. If it's connected to the registration of the product, it may eliminate some issues about whether it's a trade secret or protected by some other provision or something like that. But assuming that you had the data and you figure out a legal way to get it, I would think it would be used by different people in completely different ways. I would think that the drug companies would use it one way, researchers like Professor Sampat would use it a different way, NGOs would use it one way, I think Google would use it some other way. I mean, I think that the data would just deepen our understanding. Patient groups would have a different take on things. I think it would just deepen our understanding of what's going on in the pharmaceutical market and move us toward a more enlightened approach without prejudice to sort of what conclusions people might reach. But I think people would have maybe ideas of what kind of data would make decisions more rational. I mean, that's kind of how I would approach it.
And where would you see, at what stage would you see then the data being disclosed then? At the when you apply for marketing approval, or when you apply for to get it listed on a publicly funded formulary?
Well, I just like it to be associated with the you know, the fact if you're selling drugs and these drugs are participating in all these reimbursement schemes, they have all these massive government programs associated with the regulation of the products, the incentives, the IPR issues, the reimbursements. Those things are all related to what our assumptions are about the economics of the field. That it would just be one of the obligations you have to do. Right now, you have to provide a lot of information about clinical trial data. You have to register trials. There's a lot of pressure on regulators to get you to put down the trials that have been done on the drug, and more pressure for outcomes information and phase 4 trials and stuff. So I think that's all good. But having more information about what's spent on marketing drugs, what's spent on clinical trials, what the prices and revenues are, would be some basic things I would start with. But Professor Sampat has a whole line of inquiry on government rights and patents, which I think would be a component if somebody could fully understand what he's up to there.
I'll let somebody else comment at this point.
But you're not convinced, though.
No, I'm convinced that
Joel, we can't hear you.
Where the best place to be.
Where are you, Joel?
Oh no.
What do you mean?
We can't hear you.
Yeah, where are you? Where are you dialing in from, Joel?
Toronto.
It's better when he's in Asia. We see it better.
All right, well,
Jamie, were you surprised to see this just as in the TPP? Was this on the radar screen of people, or?
I was completely surprised at this. It was in Chapter 8, Technical Barriers to Trade, and I was just sort of going through all these chapters. There was leaks on maybe 4 chapters of the 30. I had read most of them. I was just trying to read some of the other chapters, and this one just kind of, there were several things like this that popped out. There was a source code provision, which I was surprised to see. There was this thing on technical barriers to trade. There was just weird stuff that I found in the agreement, and I can't imagine they're doing these in secret trade agreements, and they just become binding forever. I mean, you'll never change this if these agreements are approved. It's just be impossible. And just out of nowhere, you see this crazy stuff in the agreement.
Yeah, it was surprising to me too.
But I mean, if we were more proactive as a community of researchers on transparency, maybe we wouldn't see things like this in the agreement. Because the way it's going right now is everything is moving toward protection in the TTIP as confidential business information, and it's now being redefined as trade secrets. So things like what royalties are paid, how much you spend on clinical trials, how much revenue you get, what the prices are, those are all being treated as like the formula for Coca-Cola in these new trade agreements. And I think that we're very passive on this. We're just like reading and we're surprised, but the other side's not very passive at all. They're just trying to, they have a transparency chapter, and it gives the drug companies transparency of how the government is sort of organizing itself to do reimbursements, and gives them rights to challenge those decisions. But at the same time, everything that we might find useful in looking over at their shoulder is being deemed secret.
Going back to government R&D, I think there is some openness now, or at least more than there used to be, to kind of taking the veil off of Edison. Just given the commitment to open government and things like that, I think more and more people have been. There is quite a coalition in terms of academic researchers studying university industry technology transfer that believe that the Edison data ought to be made public in a way that it's currently not. The NIH has been really the only agency that's made any moves towards that, and those two imperfect. So I think certainly on that side of things, you would find a lot of interest among academics and probably some practitioners in getting the data out there.
Bhaven, could you give a brief description of what Edison is for those of the participants who are not familiar?
Sure. Well, it's hard because nobody really knows, right? But it is, as I understand it, it is an interagency database that is administered, I think, by the Department of Commerce, but I'm not 100% sure, where different grantees from different agencies have to provide data on what happened with publicly funded inventions, including licensing data, including, you know, was there a patent taken out and things like that. I actually don't know the precise contents of Edison. That's part of the problem. But I suspect, in fact, I'm quite certain that on questions like that we were talking about before, which is, you know, how many suitors are there actually for academic technologies? Like Edison would have that kind of information, and I think, you know, I just can't see how making that. I don't see how making that more widely available would compromise anybody's trade secrets or anything like that. I don't see a good reason for keeping it secret. Even the National Academy of Sciences, in a recent report on Bayh-Dole, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, argued for more access to the Edison data, if not the whole thing, then making more fields publicly available.
The NIH right now does not release royalty rates or royalty revenue from its own NIH-owned licensed patents. And as I mentioned in this hepatitis C patent, they wouldn't even release the names of the principals in the company that were going to get an exclusive license. I mean, our dealings with the Technology Transfer Office has just been horrible. I mean, we did a margin request on to or we were involved with the Faberzyme case, I guess, that we were helping Alan Black, who's representing patients for Fabry's patients in that case, and we're also involved in a different case involving 12 drugs we thought were priced more expensive in the United States than they were in other high-income countries. And in both cases, the NIH didn't even share with us communications that we're getting from the other side in a dispute that we were involved in, and they'd share everything that we gave them to the drug companies, but they wouldn't share anything they got from the drug companies with us. That stuff we discovered it later through FOIA requests, sometimes by third parties. So we think that the NIH has been really reluctant to be very transparent about these things. I mean, that's just our own experience. I'm glad you've had a better experience, though.
Oh, I don't think I had a better experience. I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that. I just downloaded what was on their website, and I was all I mean by the NIH has been better is that the NIH actually has a list of patents that were reported to it through Edison. That's you know, that's infinitely better than the 0 that they provided previously. So and it turned out to be quite useful in my research, and more moves along those lines would be better. But I don't have any special contacts at the NIH who have been more open with information than they seem to have been with you. Everything I've gotten has been from their website or via FOIA. I think there is a certain amount of just conservatism at the agency.
Where do you get those Edison patents? Where are they found on the website?
So if you go to NIH, if you search for NIH Reporter and you go to the Exporter page, there's a Patents tab. Yeah, I actually think it doesn't work with, sorry Google Hangouts, I think it doesn't work with Chrome for some reason. You need like Firefox or some other browser in order for it to show up.
It downloads it in a format I can't use.
Okay.
But you can get, is that, how complete do you think that is for the, that's a pretty complete thing of everything it has?
No. So I think the union of reporter and government interest statements is likely to be pretty complete. As I might have gone through it too quickly, but some of the work that I did with Arthi Rai suggests that a lot of stuff with government interest statements doesn't end up in Reporter and vice versa. But if you take the two together, I think it's probably reasonably complete based on our qualitative examination. Quantitatively, it's something that I'd like to explore more. But it's much better than looking at government interest statements alone.
Well, I'd like to ask people that are participating in this to ask Professor Sampat what research they would love him to do in his next paper, because I think he's doing a new version of this, right?
That's the idea, unless you guys tell me it's stupid.
So, do people have suggestions or things that they think they'd like him to do, so we can get some some advice from all the experts in the on the hangout here.
Joel's suggestion already was very good.
Anyone else?
Yeah, one interesting thing to kind of look at would be there's a number of drugs that have experienced these price hikes, recently, and even new reformulations, and if they could be characterized as well in terms of public sector funding involvement and also tied to sales, that would be kind of cool. Because we've, at least in the drug pricing transparency work, that's something that we've been keen to look at, to see that these number of drugs that have kind of have had these kind of strange price hikes for whatever merger and acquisition or whatever reformulation, if there is also a characterization of the indirect or direct involvement of public sector there, that would be kind of a direct policy implication of, if there is public sector funding going into something where the price is kind of going out of control over a period of time, then there should be stipulations with public sector funding.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think some of the drugs were generic and really old, so I think that might be hard to do for data reasons. But I think in general, looking at high-priced drugs and the public sector involvement in kind of very high-priced drugs would be a useful thing to do, putting aside the difficulties in getting good price data. But yes, I think it's a good thing to do.
Any other suggestions from anyone?
Well, one thing that I like a lot in your health affairs paper that you don't mention here is that you pull out the HIV drugs and you found that they had a significant amount of public sector, indirect and direct support. Mm-hmm. And Joel kind of mentioned this when he was talking about the truly innovative drugs. I think it'd be really interesting to maybe break them down by drug class, like oncology drugs, orphan diseases, all those different categories, and see if there's a difference as well. And if you can connect them in the way that Joel said to truly innovative drugs.
Great, I think that's feasible.
Or the other suggestion is, because we were looking at the GAIN Act, and I know Joe Ross and John Powers in particular, they looked at the GAIN Act, all the drugs that were approved there got priority review. And the price of those new antibacterials are pretty high. But it'd be interesting to see if under drugs that were given priority review for based on a low standard, I guess that's not necessarily a breakthrough or actual improvement in therapeutic benefit like the ones that have been identified through GAIN. If that how much public sector funding actually went into that. It'd be a little bit hard to characterize, but that might be a specific class of drugs, or even if looking at a specific piece of legislation that awarded more exclusivity or more, or more exclusivity or a faster regulatory pathway. If you could look at public sector involvement versus private sector involvement, that'd be.
Mm-hmm. That too is very helpful. I'm getting a little bit nervous now, though. So one thing that I hope to do here is to try to get the data out there so that other people can do some of this stuff too. I mean, it's all kind of publicly available data, so it's just kind of putting it all in one place and writing up a little guide on how to use it and all that stuff. So some of these things, hopefully, you guys can help on the analysis side too.
So one question I ask you is, if we do another, what would your suggestions be for our next technical seminar on drug pricing? Who are your suggestions of who we should invite to do this? What we're doing with you today?
Mm-hmm. So they don't have to be. You're not interested just in empirical research, right? You're interested in people thinking about these things.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, one question I'm interested in is just different perspectives on kind of what the right price should be, how to think about drug prices, what the right price should be. I think the clinicians have a particular point of view. Economists there used to be a theory of economics of kind of just prices and all that stuff. I think it disappeared long ago. The extent to which prices, do or should reflect R&D costs, value, things like that. I think it would be useful to kind of have people from different perspectives talk through the issue of how to think about what the price should be. And I say this not knowing what I think the answer is, which is precisely why I think it'd be interesting to see smart people talk about it. In terms of names, I'll send them to you. I'll send them to you afterwards. I'll have to refer to my notebook.
Okay, I think this has really been, in my opinion, it's really helpful, and I don't know what other people think, but I thank you very much for making this presentation. Are there any concluding comments that any of the people that are online or in the office here would like to say before we conclude this this webinar? Do you all agree with me that this was like really a fabulous presentation?
Yeah, this has been very helpful, and I think it very smoothly and helped produce a really good discussion.
And I'd like to thank Joel for participating, because I think he's like our most reliable respondent, and always brings a lot to the table. And also, Rashma, it's good to have you here. You know, congratulations on your new job.
Thank you.
Very good, and thank you for organizing. It really, it was a very interesting, thought-provoking, relating for me too. And I got some good suggestions on data sources and things I can have other people do next.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're gonna say goodbye now.
Okay, goodbye.